So hi everybody, thank you for coming. Most of you know me by now, but for those of you who don't, I'm Chloe. I'm a biodiversity officer for Neath Talbot Council. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you could keep your microphones off during the presentation, just to prevent any disruption. And yeah, we'll be recording the meeting, so if you don't want to be in it, just turn your camera off. And if you want to as well, you can introduce yourselves in the chat, just because it's nice for you guys to get to know each other as well. So you won't be hearing much from me tonight, but before we do get started, I just wanted to share a couple of things that are of note. So the first thing is our grant fund is open until the end of November. So this is for you guys. You can apply for up to £10,000. So the rule with this grant pot is that it has to be on publicly accessible land, and the projects need to be delivered by the end of February. So it is quite a tight timeline now, but the fund is open until the end of the month, as I said. And yeah, so this is for any projects that can deliver against the NRAP. So you could sort of apply for things like tools for habitat management, wildlife surveys, interpretation panels, that sort of thing. If you do want to apply, email. Thank you, Rose. I just put it in the chat. Email Rose to get the application form, and she can help you with any questions as well. And then I just wanted to quickly mention about our Working with Nature project. So I will be sending more details around about these via email and on Facebook as well. But just to let you know that there will be volunteer days happening now twice a month from now until the end of March, or hopefully beyond as well. And that'll be with Ed Tucker. So the first two are actually coming up this weekend. So the first one is on Sunday in Tonner Woodland, and then the next one will be on Tuesday in Glanreed Plantation. So yeah, Ed's going to be leading these, and I can send his email around as well for anybody if you guys want to get involved. And then also just to mention about the nature walks that are running as part of the project. There are 16 walks coming up from now until the end of March. All the details for these are on the Working with Nature Facebook page, and I can also email them around as well. They've been going really well so far. We've had a total of 84 participants, which is really good, but obviously we're keen to have more. So if you guys are looking for something to do, please feel free to come along. Yeah, short and sweet from me tonight, that's all. But yeah, I can hand you over to Marie now, who's going to be giving us a talk on wildlife gardening. So yeah, Marie, if you want to take over and introduce yourself, I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Chloe. So I'm Marie Fowler. I'm the Green Infrastructure Officer. I'll be doing a double duo with Beth Parker, who is waving right now. And we're going to be giving you a bit of an overview of what can be done in the garden in terms of wildlife gardening. So do you want to start sharing, Beth? Or?
Yep, sure. 1 second. Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, looks good.
Great stuff. So yeah, hi, I'm Beth. I'm the other half of the dynamic duo. We're the kind of green infrastructure team on the council, and we're just going to talk you through some of the things that you can do in your garden for wildlife. So I'm just going to take the introduction and let my more knowledgeable colleague crack on with the rest. So what we're going to cover today, how what we do impacts nature. So, you know, how we can impact nature on a really small scale level. Gardening to help animals and insects. What to remember about gardening for nature. The do's and don'ts, and then the summary. So how do our actions impact nature? So in the seasons that we've got on this lovely graphic, we've got food and nesting in the spring and the summer, and then in the autumn, food and shelter, and then in the winter, food and pretty much shelter again. And what we will be saying, and what the key theme of this presentation will be, is to not be too tidy in your gardening, because nature likes to be wild. Nature doesn't look tidy out in the woodlands and the forests and the meadows, and so this is the kind of thing that we're going to try and bring home. But Marie is going to talk you through all of the different types of gardening that you can do for animals and insects and invertebrates, and the do's and don'ts, and how you should go about doing those in each of these seasons that I've briefly touched on. So I'll pass you over to Marie now. And Marie, just tell me when you want me to click the next slide. So I'll bring all these in.
Yeah, so I thought I would start by reminding us a little bit as to what type of animals we're talking about. Obviously, top of the list for us are going to be invertebrates, so that's insects, ladybirds, solitary bees, bumblebees, butterflies, etc. Mammals, just like little hedgehog, the smiley hedgehog, my favorite photo ever in the center, but also garden birds and very often forgotten reptiles and amphibians. Do you want to give you one more click for me?
Yep.
So why are any of these important? But important, obviously, because they form part of different ecosystems. The insects in particular, or the invertebrates in particular, should be our top priority in terms of trying to look after those little guys, because they're not just important for us, because obviously they're pollinating our crops and helping us with food production. They also form part of the main diet for many species, and all of the ones I've illustrated there, the birds, the mammals, and reptiles and amphibians, actually depend on them. So it's important that we really look after them, and I think most people will be already aware. Invertebrates are severely in decline, and how we manage the space that we have at home is just as important as the way we manage the space as local authorities. So the more we can do for them, the better it will be. And obviously, we also know that they are in decline, not just because, the way we manage our space, but also because we are losing some of these spaces, we're building on it, or they are losing the connectivity between these different spaces. And obviously, climate change is also top of the list there, as well as influencing how these things go. And as for the other species on this slide, they're all also important because they are, if they're not predators of insects, they are basically being the ones that are being predated on for other species. So it's important to keep the balance, and nature is all about balance. So as long as we have a nice balance between predators and prey, then everything should theoretically tick over like it should be. Next slide, please. So what sort of thing do any of these species need? I think most of them, we've sort of brought them all together because essentially they all need similar things. We already know that insects need flowers, they need the pollen, they need the nectar. The richer the flower, the better it is for them, because obviously it's a very important food source for them, and it sustains them and it helps them survive. Whether we're talking about flowers which are ornamental, like a lot of people will have in their gardens, or whether we're talking about native flowers, it's important that whenever we select them, if you are fortunate enough that you're somebody who can actually go and buy plants from the garden centre, it's a good it's a good tip to try to find some that are perhaps better than others. We would encourage you to go for native, because we know the native wildflowers are far better than ornamental plants. They usually have much nicer nectar and pollen to sustain our native species. So that's what we would sort of encourage people to go for. But equally, this time of the year, many people will be looking at their borders. A lot of the plants will have started to go over, started to look a bit brown and a little bit straggly. And people would be often tempted to go and wanted to cut everything down, getting ready for the winter. But the reality of it is that if you can live with a border that's looking a little bit more untidy, you're actually leaving a space for some species to actually but to actually overwinter. Like, for instance, the ladybirds like the hollow centers of flower stems, and they bury themselves in there, and they basically spend their time all the way through the winter in there till you emerge at the end of May. So if you can leave your garden looking a little bit scruffy, certainly till sort of March or April time, then you can have those species who are overwintering in those dead materials. Another obvious one, we talk about it a lot, hedgerows, trees and shrubs. All of them are really fundamental for wildlife, whether it's for species of birds to go and nest, whether it's for species like the brown hairstreak, for instance, that likes to lay their eggs on hawthorn. Whether it's a hazel that travels with dormice, and all these little small native sort of plants are really helpful to support our wildlife. Hedgerows in particular are very, very important, massively in decline across the country. Very important for hedgehogs, shocking. They form really good habitats, but also they allow for they allow for habitat connectivity as well. So the likes of hedgehogs, for instance, you use them as channels to travel, and these guys can travel quite a fair bit overnight, but they're also using them for nesting and for foraging. The bad guys a little bit in the garden this time of the year, the ivy and the brambles. Again, people think that they are hard, they're unsightly and all the rest of it, but they're really important. Ivy in particular is an amazing plant. If you're bored and you've got nothing to do, look up ivy and you'll just see just how amazing a plant it is. In September time, they tend to be in flower, and they are probably one of the last plants that will stay in flower for a long time and help them support solitary bees, for instance, just before they go and hibernate. So if you can live with having ivy, letting it do its thing, go to flower, you'll help these insects getting ready for the winter, buffing them up and getting themselves ready so they can survive. And also ivy is important because once the flowers are gold, you then get the blackberries, which are an important food source for many birds, including robins, thrushes, blackbirds, etc. So very, very important plant. And then during the sort of springtime, summertime, perfect habitat for invertebrates. They love to actually hide away behind the big sort of thick sort of root system that it has. And also they're often used for nesting as well for birds, for small garden birds. Brambles, similarly, I mean, who doesn't like, blackberry sort of pie? But aside from that, we have lot of little birds as well who love feeding on obviously on the fruits. The flower is really good for pollinators, and the straggly sort of really tight network of the stems also form good habitats for a lot of birds to run and go nesting, like long-tailed tits, for instance. And this is perfect habitat for them to forage away from sight of predators. So yeah, quite a really good habitat as well if you can live with it. Short and long grass, again, longer grass we would prefer because longer grass has more benefits for wildlife, aside from the fact that it provides places for grasshoppers and crickets and things like that to sort of colonize it. It's also a good source for longer grass once they go into seed. The little chaffinches love munching on them. So it sort of provides quite a nice habitat for many species, and reptiles also use it. Amphibians use them as well. And then the shorter grass is equally important, where you have like short lawn, flowered lawn in particular, where you can have all matters of smaller insects actually navigating through it. And it's really good for invertebrates as well to have those dynamic in the landscape. So if you can have a garden that has different heights of vegetation, you help really support many species of wildlife. Water, an obvious one. We wouldn't be able to survive without water. It's no different for any other living things on the planet, including plants. I mean, water, for instance, this time of the year, if you can leave like a shallow dish of water outside for birds will use it for drinking. They can go and sort of bathe in it as well. Yeah, that's quite important for that. And a lot of insects also lay their eggs into the water. So if you can have like a little pond, or even if it's just a shallow sort of dish that you've buried partially in the garden with some stones at the bottom, they make perfect habitat for these guys as well. And obviously for toads and frogs, etc. Log piles and fallen leaves. Log piles, again, many inverts actually live off it. So that's anything, millipedes, centipedes, woodlice, beetles, all matters of insects sort of thrive on it. Perfect as well for fungi to colonize as well. So you can have some nice sort of fungi sort of developing on them. Fallen leaves, quite an important thing. Actually, we're very quick at trying to sort of clear the leaves off the lawn because we don't want the lawn to die underneath it. The fallen leaves are an important material for nesting. Hedgehogs in particular love actually gathering them and use them as nesting material. And compost heap, another one which most people wouldn't think about. Compost heap's a compost heap. The fact is that it generates a lot of heat. So the likes of grass snakes, for instance, will like to lay their eggs in nice sort of good sort of warm sort of conditions. So often they might use that as a space to go and do that. Hedgehogs love them because you'll have slugs, snails, and all matters of other insects sort of thriving in it. But also insects themselves, all matters of insects that are involved within the sort of the composition of the material or rotting it down, helping it rot it down a bit quicker. All of that sort of is perfect haven really for them. In the same breath, as I mentioned about brambles and ivy, any area that is overgrown, that has been undisturbed for a period of time, perfect habitat again, somewhere where the smaller sort of mammals or birds, etc., can actually go and forage and nest. And then any areas that are sort of sunny, especially areas of bare soil, solitary bees actually like to nest in them, so they make like little holes in the gaps, and they go in them and nest within the gaps. But likewise, anything to do with rockeries and banks that have been constructed with a mixture of soil and stones, where you have like little crevices or little gaps in between, you'll often find things like lizards or snakes actually going into it. So you're basically creating a bit of what they call a hibernaculum. Next slide, please. So what can you do? There are some things in there, and I don't think any of it really is particularly taxing. It's just rethinking the way we manage the space that we've got. So for instance, when we're looking at the grass, as I mentioned, it's nice to have variations in the landscape. So if you can have your grass that you manage as a meadow, for instance, so instead of perhaps cutting it every fortnight or every week, you essentially relaxing the mowing, so you're only cutting once or twice a year. So it's less work in the garden, really, so the way I look at it. But what's fundamentally important is once you've cut the grass, you've got to make sure you take the clippings away. The idea behind that is that by taking the clippings away, you're impoverishing the soil, so the grass grows not as tall, and you have more wildflowers colonizing it. Because the issue with cutting grass regularly and leaving the clippings over the surface is that the clippings wash in, it then feeds the grass, so you get more grass, and the grass goes quicker and it goes like crazy. Whereas if you sort of reduce the amount of cutting you're doing, take the clippings away, then over a period of time, over like 2 to 3 years, you'll start seeing that the grass won't be growing as tall, and you'll have more wildflowers thriving because there's less competition from the grass. You can also compost your green waste if you're in a position where you can do that. If you can compost it, again, you're making a compost heap or habitat pile for reptiles and for other species. If you can leave an area of your garden, a corner of the garden, go wild. I'm not suggesting that you got to go and sort of stop managing your garden altogether, because ultimately it is our space as well. But it would be nice if people just even had like a small corner that is managed perhaps less intensively than the rest, because then you do have support. It's quite surprising actually how many species you'd be able to support there. If you do put water out for the birds, again, make sure that if there's any frost or whatever, that you break the ice so they can access it even in cold conditions, and make sure that whatever water you put out, there is something at the bottom so that they can actually climb out and have an escape route if they need to, so they don't drown. Things that people are most things that people most do more commonly, things like putting bird boxes, bird feeders, bird baths, bug hotels, all of that, things that are becoming more and more commonplace, easy enough to purchase, easy enough to make. But you could even use any debris from the garden, so any piles of logs, any stones and bricks that you sort of put together, anything that's got nooks and crannies where little creatures can go and climb in and out, or hide away or whatever. And as Beth mentioned earlier, what we're saying is that please don't rush to tidy up. The longer you can leave the garden looking perhaps a little bit less tidy that you would like, the better the conditions are for wildlife. Thank you. So just a few things to remember here. I thought it'd be worth mentioning it. A lot of people may not necessarily know or realize when the seasons are. So in terms of managing hedgerows, if you're lucky enough to have somebody who has hedges or bushes and stuff like that in the garden, please remember there is a bird nesting season which goes from March to September. And really, by rights, you shouldn't be doing any clippings or any cutting back of those during that time frame, because you could potentially disturb the birds, disturb the nest, or even worse, actually destroy a nest in the process. If you do feel that you want to do some maintenance on it, I would recommend really skimming the surface, not going deep into the size of the hedges, and or actually really making sure that there is nothing there growing. But as a rule, I think to be safe, I would recommend not touching it between March and September if you can. As I mentioned earlier with the snakes, some of the grass snakes, for instance, like to lay their eggs in compost heap. You notice that there's little gaps underneath the heap or whatever that could potentially indicate that there's something actually goes in and out of it. It could be you have a grass snake goes in and out. So you may want to make sure you don't actually turn over the compost heap between sort of middle of June and September, late September, because you could potentially destroy the eggs. And as far as my best friend ever, the little hedgehog, is concerned, I know we've sort of missed the deadline in terms of Guy Fawkes Night, but if you were to have built up a bit of a log pile in the garden with a view of setting fire to it later on in the year, we would definitely recommend actually checking before you light any fire, because you could actually kill these little guys, because they will have found their way in there. Equally, if you have hedges, please don't stray too close to them, underneath them, because these guys, especially this time of the year, maybe actually underneath piles of leaves or debris underneath, you may not see them, and you could actually really hit them and hurt them pretty badly, or even kill them. And similarly, when I mentioned about the leaves, you may sometimes see in some gardens little balls of, it looks like a pile of leaves that have been put up in a nice rounded sort of shape. It could also be you have a hedgehog hiding away underneath there. So if you are doing any work with your leaves on the grass, please be careful, because it could be you disturbing these little guys. And similarly, as with the grass snakes, please don't turn over the compost heap too quickly, or actually make sure that there's nothing going in it, because you could disturb them, and again, like I said, either injure them or potentially kill them. Next one. The do's and the don'ts. A lot of this stuff is probably obvious to many people, but it's just a nice reminder. Think of what needs to be not to be done or to be done, depending on which way you look at it. Big top of my list, and this is my big bugbear: don't dump your garden wastes in the wild. I know, again, it's an obvious one, but so many people do it. They think there's no harm in it, but actually there is. In particular, this is particularly relevant for those people who have clippings from their hedges. So if you're taking things like prunus, the laurel, for instance, very, very vigorous sort of plant in the garden. The moment you start cutting it, it reroots very quickly. So if you dump those clippings in the woods, the likelihood is that you're actually spreading the species, which is non-native, into the wild. So don't dump your garden waste, is the best thing we can say. And it's equally, in the same breath, don't start planting plants from your garden into the wild either. This is where we're a bit of trouble with the Spanish bluebells being one issue with it, but also many other plants that can become quite invasive. The other issue you may have with some plants, like for instance buddleia or butterfly bush, as many people know it as, again, they need to be managed in a way so that they don't spread and have a negative impact on the environment around your properties or next door or whatever. An obvious one: don't use chemicals if you can avoid it. Chemicals, we mean by that weed killers, fertilizers, etc. Don't use slug pellets, because the slugs then get ingested by the hedgehogs, and then you're causing this sort of a chain effect on how badly it can affect these creatures. And try not to let non-native species invade the wild. So as I mentioned earlier about the buddleia, there are some steps that can be taken to make sure that they don't actually spread either through seeds or through clippings into other parts of the country, as I like to say. But have a look at the do's a minute. So again, the obvious one: recycle your green waste. If you can't have a compost heap, and not everybody has the space to do that, then please put your green recycling as part of your weekly recycling with the council. Or if you can, burn it, even better. But the reality of it is, please don't dump it in the wild. Recycle it sensibly, and try to make sure you're not spreading things that you don't really want to spread elsewhere. Try to favor native over non-native if you can as well. And likewise, if you're seeing like these lovely little daisies now growing in the grass, I know for a few people this is like a nightmare. They absolutely detest seeing them. But the reality of it is they're really good plants. They don't do any harm. It makes your lawn look a little bit nicer. So if you're happy to let them grow, just let them grow. They're not hurting anyone. And actually they are providing food source for insects. You can use alternative methods, for instance, to deal with unwanted plants. So I don't like using the word weeds, because really technically they are wildflowers. But if you so happen to have, I don't know, dandelions growing between your pavings in the garden and stuff like that, just ask yourself the question: can I live with it? If you can live with it, then leave it, don't touch it. Or if you can't, there are other mechanical methods you can use. So whether it's hoeing them, trying to dig them out, burning them in some instances, although burning's got its own issues, but there are other alternatives. That means you don't have to use chemicals. that could potentially then seep back into the soil or into the water system that we have. You can make your own fertilizer, again, using nettles or comfrey. Simple enough to do. Literally, you use the foliage, chuck it in a bucket of water, leave it to stew for about 4 weeks, and once it's lovely and smelly, you can then use it as nettles tea or comfrey tea, which can be then mixed with some water, and you can use it as fertilizer for your flowers, your fruits, your garden, your pots, etc. We're talking about slugs and snails more specifically. Instead of using pellets, there are other materials that can be used, whether it's crushed eggshells, wood ash, bear traps, although I think it's a bit of a crawl to do that to them. But there are other methods that can be used, which are less, that don't involve using chemicals, essentially, that could be harmful then for other species as well. Or even better still, create the right conditions. So as I mentioned earlier, talking about balance, nature likes to have balance between things. If you're encouraging the likes of toads or hedgehogs in the garden, then slugs will become less of an issue then. And then finally, please choose your plants wisely. So I'm not going to be sitting here and say to you, you cannot have any ornamental plants in your garden in like ever. All I'm saying is please do your research. The RHS are very good in their descriptions. They tell you whether or not the plant is vigorous, for instance, so you will know whether it's something that could potentially take over the garden. So then it gives you the option to decide, do I really want this plant because it's going to go crazy in the garden? And if you don't, then don't buy it. But if you think, oh no, it's really pretty, I really want it, then think of ways in which you can control it so it doesn't go and spread elsewhere. So it's not that difficult really. Nowadays we have access to vast sort of library of information about plants. And then there's loads of people you can ask as well. I wouldn't ask necessarily the staff in the garden centre, but do your research online or through magazines and things like that. And they usually give you some good tips on it. And I'm going to go quiet and hand it back over to Beth.
So yeah, thanks very much. So just to summarize what we've talked through, really, so our gardens are a haven for wildlife. They're this unaccessed part of nature that, you know, we don't manage necessarily for nature. We normally manage for tidiness. But they can support and do support a massively wide range of species. And just by taking a little bit less effort in your gardening, which I'm sure lots of us will be quite appreciative of, you can actually encourage way more species into your garden and improve that space for the species that are currently there. You can become a wildlife champion from your own home. So you can basically make your garden a habitat for nature and give extra space for nature in your back garden. You can observe, record, and tell the world about it. So you can, you know, come along to these meetings and tell us the wonderful species that you found. Talk to us about, as we were talking about earlier, the badgers, the hedgehogs, the wonderful butterflies that you've had in your back garden. And as Marie said, you know, small acts can make a big difference. Just not trimming your hedgerow in bird nesting season, or leaving a small area of your garden to go wild, or not turning your compost at particular parts of the year can make a big difference for that one species which is struggling otherwise. And as the theme that we've gone through for this whole presentation, you know, don't be too tidy. Nature is wild. It likes to be wild. Leaves fall and stay on the ground for a reason. And so, you know, if you can just take that little bit of an extra step to maybe not tidy up as quickly as you'd want to, you'll encourage loads of species that do actually enjoy that part of nature. And so I think that's it. So it says let's do some fun activities. Sorry, that's I should have taken that off. That's left over from when we did it in person. So if you ever want to come see one of our presentations in person, we'll make sure that Chloe is advertising them, because then you can actually do some fun activities. Apologies that that's still in there. And that's the end of that. So I guess I'll hand back to Chloe, and if anybody has any questions, we can field from there. Thank you very much.